Buddy. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second information session for the Metaverse for SDGs Global Prize in VR competition. This is the Exponential Destiny team, and this is the series of conversations and orientation sessions that we have to provide the community of individuals and teams that are competing on this competition with tips and tricks, access to resources, and just trying to keep everybody informed, especially those of you that are new to virtual reality in the metaverse. Appreciate everyone attending today. If you have any questions, just add them to the chat and we'll have some Q&A at the end. Specifically, who's here? We covered this last time when we had the first session, but we've got about 52 countries represented. And we have close to over 400 registrants at this point. And as we discussed during information session 1, you all should have registered as an individual. So you receive the communications, and eventually you're going to register your teams, although you don't have to register as teams immediately because you have some time to figure that out. 2 weeks ago, when we had the first information session, we covered a lot of the basics in terms of what this competition is about, who is it for, what the roadmap looks like from now until next June when the competition's over, the role of the UN and the ITU, the role of Exponential Destiny, how we're here to support you. And we covered all of those things, how to think about the hardware, how to start looking at the software. We shared with you some of the software platforms that we think are good for you to use. And then just some of the basic, rules and guidelines for the prize competition itself. So if you miss that information session and you need that basic orientation, please go back and watch that. That's on the website, www.sdgmetaverseprize.org. You'll see it listed on the website, but more specifically, you'll find it on our YouTube channel, the SDG Metaverse Prize YouTube channel. And you can get to that YouTube channel from our main website, just by clicking on the link. But that's where we're going to store this information session as well as all the previous information sessions and all the ones we continue to do. So you'll have it all organized on that website and you can follow it in order in case you can't make these information sessions live. Okay. So with that said, let's talk about what we wanted to accomplish today. And I've got my colleagues, Marco, Samantha, and Juan from the Exponential Destiny leadership team, and they're going to help with this discussion today. But specifically, where you should be thinking right now is your plan of attack, your game plan for how you approach with your team diving into this thing from a design perspective. With the sustainable development goal out of the 17 that you think your team is going to choose, how do you start to roll up your sleeves and get in and start creating? And although we think part of the beauty here is that you can be very somewhat random and just experiment and not afraid to fail and just start working on things, we feel it's important to give you guys a little bit of structure in terms of your thinking using a methodology called design thinking, which is a professional methodology that people use to design software, to design experiences with games. And we're using elements of design thinking in how you come up with your approach for your metaverse SDG experience. Okay, so we're going to keep it quite simple. There's 6 steps to this process. These are steps that Exponential Destiny has created as part of our methodology. You can use these steps if they're helpful to you. You can modify these steps if you'd like, or you can use something completely different if you'd like. We're not saying this is the only answer for how you go about this. This is just the method that we've been using in order to start from a blank slate and start thinking about, how do I approach this? How do I start thinking about building empathy, awareness, and education around my sustainable development goal using virtual reality? Because that's, as you remember from information session 1, that's the criteria you're going to be judged on. Okay. So at a high level, first, obviously, you've got to figure out which SDG your team is going to focus on. You can research all the SDGs and make a determination. Many of you have already determined your SDG. So the question is going to be, how do you start doing research about that sustainable development goal? Because if you need to create a virtual reality experience that's immersive and interactive around your SDG, in order to build education, awareness, and empathy, you have to educate yourself around that sustainable development goal. And there's a lot of resources for that, and we'll get into that in a second. But that's the first step. Do some research. The second step is become a good storyteller. Design a narrative. How are you going to tell a story about this sustainable development goal that educates, builds awareness, and empathy? You're not going to get into virtuality and put a bunch of web pages that show details about the SDG or bullet points. That's boring. I can just look on a website if I wanted to do that. So you have to start thinking about telling a story, and we'll get into a little bit of some of that approach and some ideas for that. The third thing you're going to do, and this is kind of unique to the way Exponential Destiny does this type of design thinking, is you're going to have to incorporate what we call Edu-tainment strategy, education and entertainment. And we have a 2x2 exercise that you can do as a team that will help facilitate that process. So we're going to go through that. So these are the 3 core steps. Once you get done with those 3 steps, you're ready to start to create experiences and experiment. And this is where you're going to do things like persona mapping and journey mapping and persona profiles. You're going to start to get feedback from people, friends and family. They can start to look at your experiences that you're creating and get feedback. And it's okay to fail. Some things people will like, some things they don't like. The good thing is you're dealing with digital real estate, so there's no real cost, huge cost of failure, right? And we'll talk about this healthy notion of not afraid to fail, that's part of the learning process, okay? And then lastly, what we call a minimum viable product or minimum viable experience and a crawl, walk, run strategy. Now, on today's discussion, we're only going to get through 1 through 3. In 2 weeks, we'll go through steps 4 through 6. So we're really going to cover these. My colleagues and I are going to cover steps 1 through 3 today. Okay. So with that said, let's look at number 1. Again, if we put ourselves into your shoes, where you should be in June of 2022 with this competition is selecting your sustainable development goal. Many of you, because we surveyed a lot of you, the vast majority of you have already picked a sustainable development goal that you're interested in. No poverty, gender equality, quality education, good health and well-being, etc. What we wanted to share with you, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Samantha, because she's going to share with you literally how easy it is to go do this research. Because as you would imagine, because this is the United Nations SDGs, there's a significant amount of high quality resources and educational information that will get you to be in known time very knowledgeable about your sustainable development goal. But you need to spend some time researching it, not just browsing, but really researching it to really understand it. By the way, that should be fun, because if you're passionate about the SDG, you're going to really get well informed in terms of the issues and opportunities with that SDG. So with that said, let me stop sharing my screen. And Samantha, why don't you share with folks how organic it is to do this research and how much resources there are actually available to them on the internet alone.
Yeah, so hello everybody. I hope you're all doing well. I'm gonna share my screen as well just to show you guys. So research is one of the easiest things, and it's honestly kind of fun when you actually get into it. You can do the old school traditional methods of going to the library or physically talking to somebody, an expert in that field, or you can just use handy Google. So just looking up simply SDG number 4, just for say, all these resources already start coming up just right here and there. And as you scroll down, you can see different articles from the UN themselves, other resources like schools. They have videos, United Cities and local governments. And if you keep going, the resources are honestly endless. And if you're not too sure exactly which SDG you're interested in specifically targeting for this environment, you can go to our website and scroll downward all the way to our SDG section. And right here, we'll have a link to the 17 categories. So if you want to look into every single category right here, this page has every single SDG. And if you click on one, it has information about it, different statistics about it, different goals that they have for the SDGs, and then it leads you to more stories about the SDG itself. So these are just some of the resources that are offered, but if we also want to share resources that we find with the community, as we mentioned previously, we do have our SDG Facebook page, our group. And so under the topics, you can go to the SDGs, look for the SDG you're interested in or found a really good resource about, and share with the group for the rest to see as well.
Yeah, the goal there, as Marco shared last week, we created this forum and this Facebook page. So you can go to that Facebook page, and if your focus is on SDG number 4, quality education, you click in there, and that's where we're encouraging people to share links and resources. If you found things that were very helpful, share that with the rest of the community. Thank you, Sam. That was great. I'll share my screen again, and we'll go back to the second step. But, simple enough, and many of you have already done this, but you want to go in and with your team, learn. Remember, your goal is to teach empathy, awareness, and education about the Sustainable Development Goal. The awareness and education is going to come from finding the data online, because the United Nations has significant amount of plans and goals and research about what are the issues and opportunities with this SDG, and educating people on that. That content already exists. You don't have to reinvent that content. What you need to reinvent is how it's communicated in a much more interesting, engaging way. Because as you can see, what Samantha just took you through, those are great resources, but that's not particularly immersive or engaging. That's text on a screen that you're reading through, or videos to watch. What you're going to do is try to take that to a whole nother level by making a whole experience around it within virtual reality. That's immersive and interactive with a lot more superpowers and tools than you could do on a website or in a video, right? So thank you, Sam, for that. Simple enough. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is, once you figure out the data, the plan for the SDGs from the United Nations, the issues, the opportunities, the statistics, and you start to make sense of that education element, because you're dealing in virtual reality, you don't have to stick to the limits of a 2D screen or video, as we've been describing. You're going to have an immersive 360-degree environment, which means you can produce theater, you can produce narratives, you can tell stories, you can bring in rain, you can bring in mist, you can bring in thunder, you can put any object in this environment. You can do so much in this environment. It's just really only limited to your imagination. So this is where you have to put your storytelling skill set, up front. And that means, let me take all this education information that I'm looking on the website to learn about these SDGs, but how do I want to articulate this in a way that tells a whole story and a narrative? Almost, I like to give this as an example to creating theater, because you're going to have tools in this environment where you can actually make like a stage production. You can have avatars walking around and talking. You can have objects moving. You can, like I said, you can bring in rain and mist. You can bring sound effects. So it's almost like the resources if you were making a play and you wanted to bring in all this elaborate interactive objects and tell a story. So you have to start thinking about telling the story. It's not the easiest thing to do, and maybe some people on the team are good at it or better at it than others. Samantha, who you just heard from, is an art major, and she's very good at telling stories. And that's actually a very premium skill set when you design these places. But you need to start thinking about, how do I tell a story? For that, Juan is going to take you through some examples of where we've done this before, literally showing you some of the mock-ups some of the teams created. Now, we didn't do this around the SDGs in the projects we've done. We've done it around other topics that were important to the schools that we work with, et cetera. So you can completely ignore the content in these slides that Juan's going to show you. But we just wanted to show you that every team has a different way of doing this exercise. There's no right or wrong answer. You might be a more visual person and you want to tell a story by literally going from start to finish, like writing a book. Someone else might do it by creating a decision tree. Some of you might put this information in PowerPoint and share it as a way to articulate it to your team members. Some of you might actually get a sketch pad out, like an artist, and start drawing on a sketch pad. You don't have to use PowerPoint to do this. You might start drawing it on a sketch pad and then show that to your team members, or a whiteboard. But the creative process of telling the story is something that you go through iterations, but you have to start somewhere. And with that, I'll turn over to Juan. Let me stop sharing my screen. Juan, you can take them through some examples of what that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, hello, everyone. This is Juan from the Exponential Destiny team. So let's kind of walk through you guys through the process of how we go about telling a story. More specifically, telling a story inside the metaverse, right? So from what you guys are seeing in my screen right now, this is a group that was creating the script around financial literacy. And, you know, this is kind of how they went about it. They had different sections in their parts. You know, we're not going to get too into detail, but, you know, they start off part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4. You know, they're creating a whole storyline here. And then each different part, they get into very precise detail of, you know, of what they want inside those sections of their space. So you see that, you know, this is not really visual, but this is really well written out. And it has a lot of detail and a lot of structure. And you see that you'll start to notice this between different groups and about the thought process they go through. As Marcus mentioned, some groups may like to just, you know, not do it on PowerPoint and wants to start writing it down and, you know, create an entire template of how their space will look like. But let's move on to a different, to another group. This is another financial literacy group, you know, with the same concept, same idea of creating a space around financial literacy, but you see their thought process is entirely different. They don't have a lot of text, but they have a lot more visuals, and you can see that they're still telling a story. So you see they go from theme 1, theme 2, and then, you know, the different cycles of the 3 little pigs, which is the narrative that they were going to tell here. And they you know, they start to create their education factor and their wow factor, and, you know, they have a different you know, a different approach from the last team. And that's how you start to see and start to differentiate how you can start to create inside the metaverse and tell a story. Now,
then, hey, Juan, before you go back to the 3 little pigs slide. Yeah, you know, like, this is interesting, right? Because this team is talking about financial literacy, but when they said, how do we turn this into an interesting story? They thought, you know what, let's make this something familiar that every young person grew up with. Maybe every young person. I don't know if it's a global story, but I grew up listening to the 3 little pigs as a merry-go-rhyme or whatever it's called. And so, you know, this team just started to sketch out, like, what if we had the 3 little pigs and we talked about the 3 little pigs learning about financial literacy? Again, it's just a more interesting way to tell the story. Now, what they put here is not in virtual reality yet, but eventually they're going to think about, how do we port this over into a 360-degree immersive environment, right? Go ahead, Juan. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we, you know, the intention and the background of this is to kind of push you guys to expand your creativity and, you know, to tell yourselves that there's no limit to how you can tell this story. You know, it can be you know, for example, this 3 little pig story can be done in space, or it can be in any environment. And that's kind of our thought process of, you know, kind of showing you guys these 3 different spaces. Like this last one is this last one was part of for support for first college generation students, right? And, you know, they went about the process of creating this around you know, a loteria, which is famous in Latin America, and a really popular game here in the States, which is a Super Mario game. And they went through an entire process of creating the narrative of supporting a college student in their space and in their layout. And, you know, they got into details of, you know, what each little section of the space would look like, you know, and they even incorporated, you know, different forms and different sections that a college student might need. But you see the level of detail and the level of creativity that they gave. They didn't, you know, they went ahead and they're like, okay, how do we support a first college generation student? How do we get the attention of a first college generation student? And they, you know, they appealed they appealed to the gamification of the Mario game and the gamification of the Loteria, that game. And, you know, they combined them both inside virtual reality, and, you know, it became their entire experience.
Thanks, Juan. So that is, you know, step 1, use the web, as Samantha shared you, research your SDGs, easy enough. We all have access to the information online or at libraries, or as Samantha suggested, maybe there's an expert that you can get in touch with who's knowledgeable about the SDGs, and just have a good old fashioned conversation with someone about it, right? So there's a variety of ways. If you need help with any of that, you can let us know. But there shouldn't be any real issues with learning about the Sustainable Development Goals. The second thing, as Juan just went through, is this whole notion of telling a story. Again, all you're trying to do is take educational content that you researched and put it into something interesting. okay? And you can go through iterations. You can try something and decide, well, that didn't work that well. I want to try something else. You might be a couple weeks into it with your team off of some concepts like the 3 little pigs that Juan just shared. But I don't know, maybe after a few weeks, someone on the team says, I don't know if the 3 little pig idea or that metaphor is working that well to tell this story. Fine, scrap it and start with something new. That's the whole experimentation. That's how you do trial and error. That's a mentality of not afraid to fail, okay? You don't have to get it right the first time. As a matter of fact, a good designer knows when they need to fail something fast and start new, okay? It's part of the learning process. Now, the third step, which is kind of the exciting exercise that your team will eventually get to, is you've researched the data. You've started to make some sense of how you're going to tell the story. Now you got to go through an exercise to make it what we call edu-tainment, education and entertainment. And we found this is probably the most important step, because what we identified when we worked with schools and teachers and students, if we put a group of teachers in a room with a group of students to build out this virtuality space around a learning topic, we noticed that the teachers wanted to create a virtuality environment that was all education. Okay, and I'll share with you what I mean by that. All education meaning the subject matter, what's the proper learning technique to teach this topic, what's the instructional method to teach this topic, very concise, and make it really relevant, real world relevance. So, you know, that's what teachers do. They're very focused on the subject matter, the education. So when they get into virtuality, what do they want to do? They want to create a classroom in virtuality where there's a teacher at the front of the classroom as an avatar teaching the students about something. Well, why would we do that? That's what we can do in real life. We don't have to mimic real life in virtuality. We have new superpowers in virtuality. We can do something completely different. But what we saw, not all teachers, but for the most part, this is just how human behavior is. I'm used to doing it this way. So when I get into virtuality, I'm doing the same thing, but now I'm doing it in a virtual world. On the flip side, the students got into this virtual reality environment and they just wanted to make it exciting and entertaining and engaging and fun and humorous and innovative and use game mechanics and make it seem like a game. Almost to the extent that there was no educational factor. Like it was almost too much wow factor, we call it, like all these cool things to do, but it wasn't teaching anything. So when we noticed that teachers like to get in and do very educational things and stick to the subject matter and not make it very engaging and entertaining, not all teachers, but many of them in this environment. And we saw the opposite for students. They got in there and tried to make it so cool and fun and exciting and amazing and funny that it almost became too distracting and it wasn't very good. It wasn't very good at teaching real things. It was just fun. It was almost like a game, but it forgot to teach the subject matter. What we decided to do was make this exercise. And this was the basis for this exercise. We saw a need to get teachers and students to collaborate to bring those two things together. So what we suggest you do, if you'd like to, this is a good exercise. So we suggest that your team try this, is take a 2x2 like this. You can do this in virtuality. You can do this on a whiteboard, or you can do this on a Zoom meeting like we are right now. But get with your team after you did step 1 and 2, the research the topic, the SDG, try to put it into a story. Now your goal is, how do you take the SDG that you're looking at, in this case, number 3, good health and well-being, and each team member independently. So if you got, remember, each team should have 2 people up to 6 people. Each team member independently on their own, write down notes. You can even use sticky notes and start to think of 2 or 3 ideas at a minimum that you put in the wow quadrant number 1 and the education quadrant number 4. So literally map out what are purely wow factor. Don't even worry about education. Just how do you make this thing fun? How do you make it engaging? Pac-Man's, in this example, let's make a maze where you see walls and you have to go through a maze in virtuality, and each wall that you run into as a dead end has something you have to learn. And maybe you have to pick up a secret code to get through that door. Maybe make it like Pac-Man and you got to run through and eat healthy products and avoid the unhealthy products. Maybe we have points that we give teams and you get penalty. Think about just a way to gamify it, to make it fun, to make it funny, just anything to make it entertaining. Don't worry about making it educational. Just purely focus on wow factor. Okay. Then what we want you to do is the same thing on the opposite side. what is purely the educational things that have to be taught. So good health and well-being, we need to, how do you read a nutrition chart, budget, finance, planning, how do you buy things on a budget, counting calories, healthy mindset, what's an unhealthy choice, how to read a nutrition label, the perception that something is healthy, but the reality is it's not healthy. A product can look healthy, but it's actually not healthy. And purely focus on how you're going to educate people, cover the subject matter, prepare proper learning techniques. And we want you to focus on that. Don't worry if it's interesting. Don't worry if it's fun. Just focus on the education factor. So we want you to force yourself as team members to look at both extremes. And then each team member will describe to the other team members what you were thinking with your ideas on both extremes. So team member 1, team member 2, team member 3, you put your sticky notes up there, you describe it to one another. And then the final step is, as a group, you start to decide which of these ideas on the education factor or the wow factor, when we rank them, don't do very well in the ranking. They were interesting, but we're going to get rid of them. And which ones are we going to graduate to be into the top right corner of a very good idea? And how can we merge them? So you go through this process of thinking both extremes, and then you think, how do we merge these ideas, but also get rid of some of them? Because we can't do everything. So let's limit the scope, because we came up with a bunch of ideas, more than we need. Oh, I like what Samantha thought in terms of a wow factor. Let's run with that idea of making it like Pac-Man, the video game Pac-Man. And Marco, I really like the idea he had on the education factor to show like all the statistics right up front, and then have an avatar come out and teach about what these statistics mean for that SDG. So let's take those good ideas, move them up, and let's reduce or get rid of some of the other ideas that we don't think rank as high. And then ultimately, as a team, you just decide the direction you're going to go. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense to everyone, but it's just a structured way of thinking to come up with the two things you need. Edu-tainment, something that's entertaining, but something that's educational. And we think it's good to separate the two and go both extremes, and then bring them together into one cohesive strategy for how you're going to deliver on edutainment. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful for you. If you need these charts or these 2x2s, we'll put them out on the resources out on the Facebook page, the forum. But it's, it's not rocket science. It's not super complicated. It's just structured. It's just a structured way to get through this dialogue. And this is really what we wanted to cover with you today, were these 3 steps. We think that's enough for this session in terms of how do you get started? Because every one of you, if you're in this competition and you've got your team members identified, or at least a couple of your team members, and you're thinking, what do I do? Am I waiting for my headset? Do I need to download the software? Well, the reality is you don't need to do any of that yet. You can get started just by talking about it and doing your research on the SDG, creating some type of story, and start thinking about how do you make this fun and engaging, but also making sure that it educates, builds awareness and empathy, which are the goals of what you're trying to produce. In 2 weeks, when we have this next session, we're going to tell you how to advance it from there. How do you put this into experiences and walk through it from a user perspective? When you have when this thing is created and you have a student or a learner that's going to come through to learn about your SDG, how do you look at it through their perspective? How do you have empathy for their perspective in terms of what do you want them to feel and think when they go through your environment? So that's called design thinking. You put yourself inside the user, inside the persona of the person that you have coming through your space, to say, what would I want to see if I'm someone trying to learn about this? What would my experience feel like and look like? So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about not afraid to fail. And we'll talk about this notion of building this over time. We've got 10, 11 months before we're going to have you guys stop creating your environments. So you can create what we call a minimum viable environment or a minimum viable product as your first go. What does that mean? And we'll get into this in 2 weeks more, but it means you don't have to make it beautiful the first time. You want to do the minimum required to just get some reaction from people. And then as you get reaction from people and you get positive reaction, you start to invest more time and effort in that direction. Maybe you get nicer graphics. Maybe you spend time making graphics or getting prettier graphics, or you spend more time placing things in ways, or you build out the room even more. So you can do a minimum viable experience to get a reaction from your personas, your reaction from people, could be in friends and family that you bring into the environment. And that's how you're going to evolve that over the course of this competition. Okay, so these step 4, 5, and 6 we'll do next time. With that said, I'll turn it over to Marco to see if anyone has any questions, or if we have any questions that we want to tackle as a group relative to what we covered today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcus. Can everyone hear me? Great. So I've received a couple questions via the info@sdgmetaverseprize.org. Please continue to send us your emails. We are reading them and responding them in the order that they are received. Usually respond within 24 to 72 hours. One popular question that keeps coming up, I'm getting it also via WhatsApp. How can Exponential Destiny and potentially the Metaverse SDG Global Prize Competition help with hardware access? And so we're currently working on a solution.
Headsets.
For headsets. And I do ask for your patience as we are coordinating globally a solution for hardware access for those who have really serious economic need. As we've mentioned, we have a limited amount of budget for headsets, virtual reality hardware, but we're hoping to prioritize community centers who can actually help distribute access to a large group of people participating in the competition. Again, continue to send us communications. We'll be sending a virtual reality headset request form that details the requirements and eligibility and describes eligibility for the for hardware and the virtual reality headsets. That's
one of the things, just to add to that, Marco, thanks for bringing it up. We're not going to, when you demonstrate an economic need for a headset, for an Oculus Quest 2, which is the headsets we'd get people, these are about $350, give or take, with shipping and handling and taxes. We have money that we want to use to get some people headsets. If you literally can't be part of this and you want to be part of it, but the cost of the headset is your barrier. And that's after you've exhausted. What we're going to ask you is to exhaust other options. We're going to see if you've talked to your local school, your local government, maybe a local business, to see if someone would fund you and sponsor you in this competition to get you the headset. That's not a big ask. You could go to a local business perhaps, or school, et cetera. For some of you, you're not going to have even that option. And those are the ones that we want to support. But we will tell you the steps we just went through: research the SDG, tell a narrative, wow factor, education factor. You're going to notice that before we give you a headset, you're going to have to complete those steps, because then we know you're serious. We know it's time now to give you a headset because you've got a game plan and you're ready to execute. So we're not just going to distribute headsets to people based on them saying, I really want to do this and I can't afford it. Well, the way you're going to show you really want to do this and you're in it to win it is you've already done your homework and you've done those 3 steps we just described. Then we're more than happy, if you have the economic need, to say, great, here's a headset so you can get at it.
Yeah, great point, Marcus. I think that's a really important aspect to this competition. We want to prioritize those who are really committed, and we are committed to providing those based on our budget and limited resources, access to hardware, but we also want to make sure that we are prioritizing those who would most benefit from the technology. Another note is that I see that more and more people are signing up for the Facebook group, that community forum. Continue to use that. We're going to help transition some from email to the community forum on the Facebook group in the coming week. If you have any questions, info@sdgmetaverseprize.org is your main resource. That's how you get in direct contact with our team. Those are some of the 2 main points that I wanted to make, Marcus, and anything else we do. Sure.
Okay, thanks. Does anyone, we don't have to take the full hour on these sessions. As a matter of fact, it's better to keep them shorter because I know everybody's busy. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? Do we have any in the chat, or anyone that's online want to take themselves off mute and ask any questions? All righty, so we will post this because we've got a lot of people that are in different time zones. So this time zone doesn't work for others. And therefore we're going to put this out on the YouTube channel. You know what I thought, Marco, we've got to figure out, we need to put a direct link to the YouTube channel on the main website. So that way people can quickly access the YouTube channel.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. Yeah.
Cool. So, but yeah, thank you everyone. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Appreciate it.
Have a great one, everyone.
Bye-bye.